Welcome, friends, to a presentation on When We All Get to Heaven, a look at how MCC San Francisco faced the AIDS crisis. I'm Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program, along with our co-sponsors, Metropolitan Community Churches and MCC San Francisco, whose senior pastor, Reverend Daniel Borzowitz, is joining me in introducing this webinar. When We All Get to Heaven is a documentary project that tells the story of the Metropolitan Community Church of San Francisco and how it faced the personal, social, and political trials of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and 90s, including the deaths of 500 of its members. Co-creators Siri, Colom, and Lynne Gerber have produced a podcast series that is drawn from an archive of 1,200 cassette tapes recorded during the height of the AIDS epidemic. They tell the story of clergy and lay people with AIDS and those who cared for them, and the activists, theologians, and community members that joined the congregation in search of spiritual answers, sustenance, and healing. The 10 podcast episodes are available for listening on Slate. I have listened to the whole series and found it totally captivating.
I bid you welcome from Metropolitan Community Church, San Francisco. Tonight you're going to get a behind-the-scenes look at the production of When We All Get to Heaven and its co-creators. Siri Colom, PhD, is an urban sociologist who focuses on politics after disasters. She uses the lens of sociology to think about how structural oppression manifests and emerges in everyday politics of people attempting to rebuild lives and homes. She is an associate professor of sociology at Worcester State University and holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. She has recently been trained in radio production through Transom. Lynne Gerber, PhD, is the host and co-creator of When We All Get to Heaven. Lynne is an independent scholar who writes about religious responses to HIV/AIDS in the 1980s and the 90s, San Francisco. She's held research and teaching positions at Harvard Divinity School and the University of California at Berkeley. Lynne and Siri will be interviewed by Danny Ballon-Garst, who is a doctoral candidate in the Graduate Division of Religion at Emory University. He studies American religious history with a focus on the history of race, religion, and sexuality in the United States, religion and politics, and the history of LGBTQ religious activism.
To those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A function. The presenters will respond to those during the Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. If you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay on after the webinar is concluded, and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Isaiah Poole, who is the tech manager for this program. Now, I am pleased to welcome Danny, Lynne, and Siri to begin this conversation.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Reverend Borzowitz, for those introductions and for the invitation to be here and be a part of this conversation. I am so excited and thrilled and honored to be in dialogue tonight with Lynne and Siri about their new podcast series, When We All Get to Heaven. As Mark mentioned, When We All Get to Heaven is a 10-part documentary podcast series that gives us a window into the religious and spiritual dimensions of the AIDS crisis through the eyes of one specific queer Christian community, the Metropolitan Community Church of San Francisco. When We All Get to Heaven was created and produced by Eureka Street Productions, which itself is a collective of Lynne, Siri, and Ariana Nettleman, who is not here with us tonight. And I have lots of questions I want to get to about how you all came to this project, how the specific collaboration between the three of you came together. And of course, I want to delve into some of the themes that come through in the podcast episodes. But before we do that, I just wanted to say a couple quick things. One is I want to encourage our audience, if you have not started listening to When We All Get to Heaven, go start listening to it now. Well, not this second, but after this. It is available. You can find it by searching When We All Get to Heaven, wherever you listen to your podcasts, or by going to slate.com and going to the Outward feed, which Isaiah is going to provide you a link to in a second. When We All Get to Heaven is a unique window into the AIDS crisis, in part because of the rich audio archive on which this podcast series is built. By incorporating music, sermons, funeral services, and interviews, we, the listeners, are able to tap into an emotional and spiritual register of the crisis that can be hard, if not impossible, to replicate in the kind of the traditional print formats that we usually convey these histories in. And so we're really excited to talk about that. And we are lucky tonight, for those of you who have not started listening, that our team has brought a clip, a preview of what you will be in store for. So let's go ahead and cue that up when you're ready.
Okay, I'm going to cue it here. And what you're going to hear is a little, like a few seconds of narration, and then a montage that will give you a sense of just a range of the audio that we have in this collection.
Much in church. I didn't know all the different ways they channeled their grief. I didn't know any of the songs. The combination of utter queerness and utter Christianness messed with my head. I listened and I listened, and I've been listening ever since.
Dear God, there were times I hated my life.
From up here, I can see every kind of dyke I've ever heard of and a few new ones. I can see high femmes and stone butches and baby dykes.
San Francisco is as good as it gets.
We of the Metropolitan Community Church refute the claim that any person's sexual orientation needs to be changed.
I don't know whether to laugh or to cry when I think about Randy Nasser, who was losing his vision when I came to see him in the hospital, and I walked in the room and I said, "It's Jim Mitulski," and he said, "I know, I recognize the shape."
I do remember one time at dinner, and there was a very handsome male couple sitting at the table next to me, and one of us decided that they were much too attractive to be together, and we went over and told them that they had to break up and go get ugly lovers.
And I told her what safe sex is, and I told her how I aim to survive, and I told her that I didn't come out of the closet not to have sex.
Now, one of his t-shirts, I think it says, I have, is it 4 or 8 T-cells left, and I've named them? And the last one, his last T-cell is named God.
We are standing on holy ground.
I remember standing with my friend at the corner of Castro and Market, and I remember saying, I wish we could level all these pretty Victorians. And if this was a meadow, and there were 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, then people would look at it and they would understand what was happening to us here.
I stood down in front of doctors and said, "What are we going to do now?" And they looked at me and said, "Well, we're going to try this." I said, "What do you mean we're going to try? You mean you don't know?" And he said, "No, we don't."
There's a place for us.
We may not be able to cure AIDS right now, but every time a person with AIDS lives one more day, connects with one more person, eats one more meal, sings one more praise, they are participating in healing.
Each one is of infinite worth, whether that person is diseased or not. We have AIDS as a community, and God loves us.
And to the enemies who are attacking us, we say to you, we're not closing up shop. We're just starting a revival here at Eureka Street at Metropolitan Community Church, and we're going to go on. God bless you this morning. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. So what you all just got to hear right there is just the incredible production quality behind this podcast series. Not only is the narrative itself rich, filled with humor, um, filled with lingering with the moral complexities of the AIDS crisis, but right, the quality of the production itself is so moving. And so let's get right to it. Let's talk about how you came to this project. Siri, this is only the second time that you and I have met, but Lynne, you and I have known each other for over 10 years. I met you when you were a lecturer at Harvard Divinity School, and I was just a young master's student trying to find my way. But this is a more recent project for you, this podcast series in particular. So why don't you both tell us how you came to this project on MCC San Francisco, where the idea for a podcast came from, and how this particular collaborative team of the two of you and Ariana came together.
Well, I'll start and then I'll hand off when we get to the Harvard Divinity School chapter because it was the beginning of our friendship, but it was also the beginning of this collaboration those years. So, excuse me, I live in San Francisco. I moved here in 2001. And when I moved here, I had a number of friends at the Graduate Theological Union who were in MCC formation and were becoming clergy at MCC San Francisco and invited me to come to their church, which as a Jewish straight girl who just moved to the city, I was like, are you sure you want me? And they were like, yeah, just come. So I came and I became a friend to the congregation for many, many years with no intention of studying them. And then after I finished my dissertation, I was looking for another project. I was assuming I was going to leave San Francisco and move on to greener academic pastures, which all of you academics will know is a hilarious notion. But in the interim, I got a grant to study how congregations deal with trauma by looking at how MCC San Francisco dealt with remembering the people they had lost from AIDS during their 40th anniversary year, which was in 2010. And that was the germ of this project. That project didn't go anywhere. It sort of imploded for a number of reasons. But in the aftermath of cleaning it up, I was in the church office. I was doing some work there. And one of the longer term congregants came in and asked if I was familiar with this tape collection he had that he had stored under the floor of the sound room. And I was completely not familiar with that tape collection that he had stored underneath the floor of the sound room. So he introduced me to this collection that he had personally preserved. It was a collection of what turned out to be 1,200 cassette tapes of recordings of worship services, 2 worship services a Sunday, every Sunday for most of the years between 1987 and 2003. And when I saw this collection, my jaw hit the ground and I said, I will make you a list of tapes so they will be in order when the person who's going to do something with these comes along. That'll be a great thing that I can contribute. And I couldn't stop engaging it. I couldn't stop engaging it. I couldn't stop listening. And I couldn't stop thinking about the possibilities. I was teaching at UC Berkeley at the time. I had a team of students who helped me digitize a subset of those tapes. So we digitized a set of 325 tapes. And then with the intention of writing an academic book, I applied to the Women's Studies and Religion program at Harvard Divinity School and got a research fellowship to be there visiting for a year in order to work on a book on this material. And that's where our collaboration started. So I'm going to leave it to Siri to pick it up from there.
So Lynne and I met in graduate school in, I think, 2002. I was at UC Berkeley when she was at the Graduate Theological end, but she was taking classes in the sociology department because she really is a sociologist. And so we met there, became good friends and colleagues, and I would always, at various times, would meet up with Lynne in the city and work at a cafe with her and some other good folks. And so we had known each other, but then I had moved to Providence. And when Lynne came out to go for her fellowship, she was like, "Oh, you should come up and hear that I've got this audio stuff, and I think you would really like it." She knew I was very into audio, and I had started teaching it in my classes, and I was getting students to design audio projects as part of their their final assignments. And so she's like, I think you would really appreciate this treasure trove that I'm going to be playing some pieces from. So she was giving a talk, and I went up to hear the talk, and she played a clip of a sermon with Jim. And I just thought, okay, I don't know what you're going to do with this, but whatever it is, I'm going to be there. And I hope it's a big project because this is amazing. And I was like, I can't believe this. This is the most amazing thing that you had. And I only heard one clip. That was wild about it. But just the idea that of the time period, the years, the possibility of what telling a story of this particular place could say and could offer about anybody going through a crisis. It spoke very much to me. So that's how I kind of attached myself to this project, if you will. Do you want me to talk about, no, I think you should talk about Ariana, because you actually, that's through you again. So let's bring Ariana into the picture at the same time, kind of.
Okay, so as you all know, this project is created by a trio, a collective that's a trio, and our third member couldn't be here. But Ariana and I met when I was at Harvard Divinity School because she was a student in my class. She took a class I taught on religion and AIDS. And at the same time, she was in another class with a bunch of other people, and she started a podcast with them called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And it was about reading secular literature with kind of sacred eyes and using sort of hermeneutic reading skills in secular literature to develop spiritual and life meanings from that kind of literature. And so she was developing this facility with podcasting. When I first came to Harvard Divinity School, my goals were to learn how to use PowerPoint because I didn't know how to use it, and to make one audio clip so I could play it in the talk that Siri talked about. I had zero experience with audio, but Ariana had a lot of experience with it and a lot of interest in the project. So when I knew that Siri was interested and I knew that Ariana was interested, I said, let's just all get together on some random Thursday in some random room in Harvard Divinity School and just start talking and start listening. And that became a practice. It became a monthly practice that we engaged in. And it's something that we continued for the next 14 years. There's obviously a lot of places from here to there, but that's how we got started. And it was through really just sheer and utter commitment on all of our parts to really telling these stories that got us to this point.
Yeah, thank you. So we've mentioned a couple times, right, the finding of these 1,200 tapes is kind of a pivotal point in this particular project, and now even in this collaboration coming together. But I know that there's more to this archive that you've been pulling together for a while now. So maybe let us bring the audience in. What is the full extent of the archive that is at the foundation of this podcast series? How did you all pull this archive together, and what were some of the challenges you faced in doing so?
Yeah, so the archive thing has been a really interesting question because the heart of it, right, are these 1,200 cassettes. You don't get a more direct, physical, visceral sense of what this congregation was living through Sunday to Sunday to Sunday than to listen to the tapes and what they're playing. At the same time, so the reason that those tapes were indicated for the garbage, had been placed in a garbage pile, is because the church was moving from its building and they were cleaning out. And so when they cleaned out all of the conventional paper that most traditional historians would want to use in reconstructing a history like that. Board minutes, budgets, long-term planning, retreat agendas, all of that traditional paper gone. So we have like this incredibly rich lived Sunday to Sunday archive and this very sparse paper archive and almost no interview material from people who were still alive and had stories to share. So from the beginning, from even before when Siri and Ariana and I met, I had sort of a plan to supplement this archive, one by interview materials, by doing multiple sitting oral history interviews with people that I knew who were still around. And I did them on shitty recorders because I didn't think we were doing a podcast. I thought this was for the library. So I did all of these interviews, multiple. And then I started developing a relationship with the church's historian, Lynne Jordan, who's also known as the Church Mother, who you will hear in episode 10 if you listen. And he had an incredibly robust collection of papers. And then as I started interviewing people, different people were like, hey, I have a box in my garage. Hey, I have these letters in a drawer, or I got these pictures. Are you interested? So I became sort of the unofficial collector of stuff from all these people who had materials. So what we developed over time in partnership with the San Francisco Public Library is kind of like what is now like a three-part archive. One part is all of the tapes from MCC San Francisco, and then whatever papers they had. So there is some paper record from MCC San Francisco. It's just not as robust as it would have been if we had gotten there before they had decided to move. And then Lynne Jordan, the church's historian, has a collection of paper that he's contributed. And then I've contributed all of the oral history interviews I've done to a certain date. I last checked up on it during COVID. So there's work to be done, and everybody's papers who sent papers to me, I sent along to the library. So now, and Danny, I think that you've actually used some of the papers in that collection for your own work. So the whole point is to make these materials publicly available for other kinds of research, other kinds of stories to be told, that kind of thing.
That's great. And so I guess I will say, no, I love the work that you've done. I personally have benefited from it myself. When I was in San Francisco, I was able to go to the public library and to work with some of the material you collected there. I will also say, as I hear you describe the breadth of this archive, and I think this has been the reaction of some folks who do history professionally and some who do it vocationally, how did you all your process? How did you even begin? How does one begin to organize an archive of that breadth, and then to hone it down into 10 one-hour episodes for a podcast series?
Well, again, maybe I'll talk about the first part and then hand it off to Siri for the second part. So we're sitting there with this archive of 1,200 tapes. I know I cannot listen to 1,200 tapes. And honestly, if you listen to 1,200 worship service tapes, it's hard to keep ears. You know what I mean? Like, you've heard a lot of opening announcements, a lot of, it's hard to keep your ears fresh. So we developed two samples. One was a kind of calculated random sample that had a set of criteria that we wanted to sort of both randomize the material that we had and get some kind of measure of representation. And then there was a sample that was just stuff I thought sounded interesting, like every Christmas, like every memorial service. And we went from 1,200 to this collection of 325. And then from 325, I listened through a lot of them and I developed a clip library. I started to develop a clip library. And I first went through for spoken things, sermons, moving moments, things that seem powerful, strong emotional responses, all kinds of things. I started just like a clip library, not even a clip library, a list. The library kind of came later. And then I did a second round for the music. Like, what music did I think was the most moving, most interesting, and that the recording quality was good enough that we might consider it. And so I went from one like infinite pile to a smaller pile to a pile of cut up things. And then there was, what do you do with all the cut up things and how do you make stories from them? And I'm going to let Siri take it from there.
Yeah, so there's, there were a couple of things that we had to do. And when I say we, I mean Ariana and I, in order to kind of catch up and get up to speed with at least some of the archive that Lynne knew so well. And one of it was we just had to do a lot of listening. And so there was this level of just kind of digging in. Lynne had large categories, like she was talking about, like spoken. This is just kind of, or like, atmospheric or singing, and clips from sermons. And, we would kind of randomly get in and listen to one. And if something if something really struck us, then we might go to the original tape and listen to a much larger selection of it. So a lot of these were ways, they were kind of ways in to the archive. So just a kind of constant listening. Every time we met, we would listen to a selection. We would decide, hey, I want to listen to this clip, and this clip. And then sometimes we'd bring one back and we'd talk about why it was meaningful to us, or when we'd have some kind of listening, what did we think about this and that? So we're doing that kind of work, as well as thinking about what are the kinds of stories that we might tell. There were a couple of key moments that Lynne was like, listen, this is a key moment. Some people have talked about it. I think we might want to do something. But then there were a lot of things like, what kind of information do people need to hear if we're telling a broad story? How can we use this archive to capture some of what's going on? What could we say about it? So there's both the in-depth listening, as well as thinking about a possible arc. I mean, we started thinking about a possible arc for an 8-episode series really early on. Obviously, it's not an 8-episode anymore, but so there was the kind of, again, the digging into the archives, coming back out, reflecting on it, digging in, coming back out, this back and forth that would happen. And then at some point we realized we needed to have a little bit better facility with the clip archive. And Lynne had made a first cut, but then once we started building stories, then we were making a lot more. We were pulling more and more clips, and we were adding more. And so what do we do with that? And how do we add those? So we set up a database. And I love Airtable. I don't know if I love Airtable, but I love to learn about it. So I was like, I think Airtable will work. Let's try it. So we set up essentially a large relational database, where we thought about what were the categories that we wanted that were really important. How could we label it? We spent a whole day talking about labeling, which is, in what way do we label these clips such that we can find the thing that we want to find when we need to find it? So there was the labeling conventions, there was the naming conventions, there was what are the keywords? How many keywords do we have? And how do we sift through based on certain keywords? What is important to us? So we have now a massive database that I think now includes maybe over 800 clips. I should look at it again. It's been a while. We had to we reached the limit, which was 500. And so now we had to split it in half. So it's somewhere between maybe 600 and 800 clips that we have pulled that are part of this large database. And that doesn't include what we kind of copied that and made an interview database, which is essentially another clip library of all of the interviews that Lynne did, and Ariana and I also contributed some, but primarily Lynne had been working on the interviews for such a long time. And so we have a kind of interview database. So that is the kind of nuts and bolts of facility with this massive amount of information. It's happening in a bunch of different ways, is I guess kind of how I describe it. But 10 years, I mean, that's part of the reason why we spent so long, is that it's a huge database. It's covering a huge space of time. And we really wanted to make sure that we understood what we were listening to. So.
Can I give a really specific
yes, please.
Actual example? So there's a lot of things that go into whether or not you can make a story of it. One is, do you hear it in the tapes? Do people talk about it in their interviews? And can you get enough material to do it? So the example that I want to give is for episode 4, which is called Friends in the Fire. It's about MCC's relationship with the Devil Rock Baptist Church, which was an African-American, it still is an African-American church in Bayview, Hunters Point. And it's the very first tape in the collection. And this woman gets up on stage and she talks about homosexuality being sinful. And we're like, what the hell? This is the first thing on the first tape, is this? And then we listen to the second tape, and Jim Matulski, who's the minister, is like, I need to talk to you about that sermon last week. And yeah, that was kind of awkward, but blah, blah, blah. So we know that this is likely a very, very interesting story. But what can we learn about it? So this was one of those stories that we had had on our radar for years and years and years and years and years. And for years and years and years, we were like, we don't have enough information. We can't find that woman. We don't think she's alive. Nobody at Double Walk will return our calls. They're going through their own catastrophe. We've heard the name of the guy who facilitated this, but we know nothing about him. Nothing, nothing, nothing. And somehow, in the 3 months before we decided that we needed to actually consider pulling it off into a whole story, Double Rock starts returning our calls. A person who was there, who directed the children's choir that we talk about, is willing to talk to us. The guy who started the whole thing, Stephen Clover, his sister gets in touch with me and sends me her journal of his last year of his life and audio from him and then video from this gospel thing. So we weren't sure this was ever going to be a story, but all of those things had to align. It was clear on the tapes that something very interesting and complicated was happening. And I had interviewed Jim, I had interviewed Bob, I had interviewed a number of people who had talked about it. But if we couldn't talk to anybody from Double Rock, we weren't going to do it. And if we couldn't figure out anything about the guy who started it, except that he used to live in P-Town and like jewelry, like that was not enough information to go on to put this together. And all of those things had to fall in place for it to actually really be able to take on its own as a full episode.
Yeah, and just to like talk about the importance of gut here is that it was this episode that we just could, or wasn't an episode. Well, it was an episode, and then it was just maybe a section of an episode, and then maybe it was just a little part. But we couldn't let it go. And there were a number of stories like that we would like just put them away for a little bit. We're like, we're not sure exactly how to do this and what to do, but we're going to keep it there. And inevitably we would come back. And so there's something to be said about kind of listening to that kind of inner part that is saying something's there, maybe you haven't figured it out yet, but you will.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that there are a couple of things that, partly help explain why this podcast series is so great is one, you see very clearly all the work that went into it, right? This is very much the product of slow scholarship, so methodologically being rigorous and intentional, but also kind of each of your different strengths coming through in how you were working with this data and telling the story. There are so many more questions we can talk about how the collaboration worked. Maybe we'll come back to some of those in the Q&A. I do want to dig into some of the major themes of the podcast, and maybe we can talk about how you arrived at those themes and how they show up through the series. And one is really the theme, which is the title of episode 3, Church with AIDS. And so I'm curious how you arrived at that episode title, but also as a major theme that is interwoven throughout the podcast series, and really asking this question about like, what does it mean to be a church with AIDS? Particularly in this moment where, and this comes through in the podcast, Lynne, that you were just describing, where, by the late 1980s, there are certainly lots of faith communities who are starting to become concerned about AIDS as the scope of the crisis, right, is starting to become more clear. This is no longer just a disease affecting gay men. This is now, it's now very apparent that Black and brown communities are also seeing, increasing numbers, stark numbers. And so you see, the Episcopal Church develops a AIDS ministry. There are Catholic ministries that are doing this as well. So what is distinct about what MCC San Francisco is doing with its AIDS ministry, and what did it mean to be an AIDS church, a church with AIDS?
Should I start that? I mean, it's a really big question, and there's a lot of different answers to it and a lot of different dimensions of it. I will say the inspiration for the title is that that's what MCC San Francisco called themselves. And in 1987, I think it was, Reverend Jim Matulski and Kittredge Cherry together co-authored an article for the Christian Century called We Are the Church Alive, the Church with AIDS. And it described for this very mainline Christian magazine what it was like to be a queer church at the epicenter of the AIDS crisis in that period of time, and what it meant to them. And what it meant to them was in part how deeply people with AIDS were part and parcel of the church's life, and it's a community. It wasn't, I mean, one way to explain what a church of AIDS with AIDS is saying what it's not, which is it's not a church with a special heart for people with AIDS. And it's not even a church with a lot of people with AIDS in it. It's a church that's asking folks to identify with AIDS so deeply that whether one has it biologically or not, that people are willing to take on this spiritual and social vulnerability of it in order to resist and fight back to help people heal in a lot of different ways, politically, socially, as well as physically. So MCC San Francisco always had people with AIDS in leadership. People were visibly sick. They made accommodation for visibly sick people to be there and sustain themselves however they needed to. They made ways to reach out to people who were sick to include them. People with AIDS developed theology there. Reverend Ron Russell Coons, who is the subject of episode 5, was a real AIDS theologian who really talked a lot about what it means to have AIDS, and he preached it to a wider church. People with AIDS were liturgical innovators. They were not just the recipients of blessings, but the bestower of blessings. And because MCC did not dither over the question of whether or not it was okay to be gay and was like, it's fine to be gay, this is not even a conversation we're having, there was none of the equivocation that was found in many really well-intentioned churches that were trying their best but could not get to a resolution about the gay thing in a way that really let certainly gay people with AIDS, and not to mention intravenous drug users with AIDS, really bring their whole selves there in a way that didn't feel somewhat, I'm not so sure about this. Are you judging me? Am I really allowed to be here? Do you only want me here when I'm suffering? Are you willing to share my joys instead? One of the phrases that MCC San Francisco developed over time was a saying they had that went, if you won't marry us, you can't bury us. And this was a response to other churches who had a kind of what we might call now like a concern trolling about AIDS, or like a particular religious or spiritual attraction to suffering, without a recognition and an affirmation of joy and pleasure and health and vibrancy that became increasingly problematic to people at MCC San Francisco and in the Castro. I mean, in the Castro, there started to be a lot of wariness about a whole range of kind of spiritual groups that would come in to see the people with AIDS in order to have some kind of proximity to suffering that was supposed to have some kind of spiritual value, that to most of the people there was like, please leave and never come back. This is not a useful thing. Being a church that identified with AIDS so deeply was part of a strategy to reduce that distance and increase the identification and increase the courage of a community to take action toward change.
Yeah, I think one of the two things I was going to say is it also is making a really strong statement towards the religious right, which at this time was, making the claim about that AIDS was, retribution for a sinful life. And so by saying that we are a church with AIDS, it's calling back and pushing that narrative out of the picture, if you will. So that's one thing. But then the other thing that just to highlight something that Lynne was talking about is it also really is bringing bringing AIDS out of a kind of individual medical thing and into the community. This is not an individual issue that people must deal with by themselves alone. This is a community issue, and we are the community with AIDS, and we are going to be responding to it as a community. And so I think that those are also like, just really important elements of that discourse and claiming that identity as a group is really important.
I was curious how like so this commitment to being a church with AIDS, how this tied into or was related to another way you describe the church, which is as a feminist church, right? In many ways, MCC San Francisco described itself as a feminist church, was committed to promoting especially women's leadership and authority. And right, we can imagine a world where those two commitments might be seen as being in tension somewhat, right? AIDS, at least in the gay community, was a disease that it was mostly experienced by men having sex with men. And so there's a world where we can imagine, right, someone saying this is just another instance of, male concerns taking center stage in the gay movement and in this gay church. Or we might imagine a world, right, where like those two commitments are actually really intricately connected, right? That what makes it possible to be a church with AIDS is precisely that this is a feminist church. So I'm just curious about those two identifications and how they relate to each other.
Well, I'll say that range of positions was present in the church itself and among the women of the church. Many of some of whom were crystal clear that solidarity with their gay brothers were what is the whole story is about, and that part of the gift of AIDS, if you would allow that, is that it created opportunity for solidarity between men and women that was much more problematic, say in the 70s, when there was a lot bigger separation between the two communities. And you saw that in things like this is in particular to MCCSF, although they participated in it, but like lesbian blood drives for people with AIDS, or the ways in which women showed up and gave care. That's certainly part of it. There were certainly women in that church and people that I talked to who were like, enough already with the AIDS and the men and the people. And the story of this church is not the story of AIDS, and the women's community in this church was a different history, and that needs to be told. And it does. We focus on that history of AIDS from the perspective of that type of person. We're perpetuating the problem, right? Like there's another version of women's history, of lesbian history, of trans history in that period that would tell a very different story if you told it strictly from that perspective. I mean, that said, the Castro was a very particular neighborhood. It was a very male dominant neighborhood, and the need was so overwhelming. And the I think that bringing a feminist lens to that need, a kind of ethic of care, or a kind of developing women's leadership and speaking out about AIDS, even if they weren't the people directly affected by it or as directly affected, but to develop that kind of leadership, to keep an eye on things that are happening in the queer world that are not just AIDS. I mean, there's a lot of ways those intersections happen. And there was a lot of different kinds of feminism at the church. I mean, there was sort of the structural commitment to, say, gender balanced leadership, which in that time meant gay and lesbian for the most part, less on the B and less on the T, and mostly 50-50. And that leadership represented on the altar, which was a very important and serious commitment, and that was represented, say, in the hymnal, that was very grounded in inclusive language, in part because of its feminist commitment, was never reflected in the congregation. It was never a 50-50 congregation. It was always a male-dominated congregation in numbers, and that's just an ongoing tension in this story about how that worked.
Yeah, I was thinking that there was the difference between kind of a theological commitment to feminism and the kind of practical, like, when you are dealing with AIDS in the moment, there is a way in which that kind of, I think in some ways, the tension that could exist, that gets dissipated because the need was so great. That's kind of what I want to say. Whereas, there were a lot of efforts, and I was thinking as well, the hymnal to really make a kind of a centerpiece of song be as feminist and as kind of gender queer as possible, in this very beautiful way. And so there were those like efforts to kind of, and the efforts in the kind of liturgical space and all of that to do it. But then again, on the ground, when like when the what hit the fan, there were particular needs that people, I think that a lot of people showed up for, even if there was those tensions that they themselves were like, I'm not always there with this, but I think that there were, more often than not, folks showed up when they were needed.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that point about the diversity of MCC, right? I mean, as someone who knows a bit about MCC's history, both as a denomination and a movement, right, there's a lot of diversity theologically and politically within the movement as a whole, but even within each particular congregation. And so I could see how that would play out in that context. I also had a question about how that might have played out in the context of political activism, right? I mean, San Francisco, as much as it was an epicenter of the crisis in terms of the number of people who were getting sick and dying, was also an epicenter of activism. So I think of groups like ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition, sorry, the name is escaping me, but ACT UP. And so what was the role of religion, queer religion, in the AIDS activism in San Francisco in general, and how did MCC SF stand within that story? Were people part of those movements, or as in other parts of MCC, was there kind of resistance to the more radical forms of activism? What was that story?
Well, it's a complicated one, and it's hard to not get to Professor Lynne about this kind of thing. And there's a lot of different ways to go into that history. So one way to go into that history is to look not just at what the congregation was doing, but what was happening in the building where that church met at 150 Eureka Street, which is in the Castro, 3 blocks from the corner of Castro Market, where the big pride flag is, where the Castro Theater is. And that building was one of the few pieces of real estate in the city that was owned by LGBTQ people. And because of that, they made it available to a very wide range of the AIDS activism that went on in San Francisco. So at one point or another, many, many, many of the AIDS activist organizations met at 150 Eureka Street, even if they were not leading Sunday services. So ACT UP was originally the AIDS Action Pledge that met at MCC San Francisco. When it became ACT UP San Francisco, it met at 150 Eureka Street until it became too full. A lot of the Project Inform community-based alternative treatment programs happen within 150 Eureka Street. So this is getting a little fine-grained, but Project Dare, which was it was like a library for all of the research that had been published on AIDS to date. So you're talking about a time before the internet where it takes 6 months to publish a medical article, and people don't have the facility or a computer to figure out where those things are published. Dare had a public library of everything ever published about AIDS, and it met at MCC San Francisco, and it met like near the copier, and it lent copies of everything published about AIDS for people with AIDS to come in and make copies of. Healing Alternatives, which was the first buyers club in San Francisco, which some people may know was a organization that procured treatments with non-documented efficacy, but that people were curious and interested in. And these treatments ranged from things like a lot of vitamin C in the early days to like St. John's wort for depression, like herbal stuff, to like Compound Q, which was developed from cucumbers, to ribavirin, which was available in Mexico, but not in the United States. And Healing Alternatives would people would order what they wanted from the Buyers Club, and it was distributed at 150 Eureka Street. So just by virtue of owning the building, making a space for those kinds of more, at the time, certainly very radical activist moves in relationship to AIDS that couldn't happen. They couldn't distribute Compound Q in a hospital. Like no one was going to do that. Like liability for an office building wasn't great. But the church made the space for that. Now, politically, MCC has always played an interesting part and relationship to the larger gay politics of San Francisco. And what that relationship has ranged from the church's founding in 1970 to today. Early on, MCC San Francisco was very much part of like the gay establishment. It was part of the founding of the Tokeless Club, the first gay democratic club. over the course of the 70s, as Harvey Milk came in, and there were sort of a bunch of, like younger people who were a bit more radical. MCC was sort of perceived as like where the old men went to pray. We don't know what's going on with them, but it's a little weird. And then once AIDS really created needs for all kinds of spiritual and end of life care and attention, it became a place that people just went. Again, the building, people just went there because they went to funerals and that's where they were. They started going to AA meetings in order to like address addiction issues so transmission would decrease. Those meetings were in 150 Eureka Street. People just came there, so it became a much more trusted place. And then I think there was a period sort of more in the 2000s where I think some folks were more like that's a relic from another time and it's a time of sorrow and we have some kind of distance from it. So it has really varied a lot. And then within the congregation itself, of course, as you say, a huge range of theologies, a huge range of political preferences, and also some very intentional leadership on the part of clergy to be engaged and to be active and to be visible and to take risks, which is something they did increasingly over the time that the podcast covers.
Yeah, I want to kind of shout out 2 episodes that in some ways touch on this. So episode 2, I think, is like an early kind of example of some of the tensions between the kind of gay community that is starting to gain kind of political power and this religious organization, and the kind of tensions between a lot of people within the gay community have very strong feelings about religion. And so like how they met. And so episode 2 really kind of starts to introduce some of that. And you see a little bit of that kind of talking. It introduces us to Troy, Perry. And then on the other end, you have episode 9, which also has a lot of the kind of what happened with as Castro and as the church was now in the kind of post-protease era and people were surviving and living, like what do you do with all of that energy? And a lot of that energy went into a lot of political action. And so you see all sorts of different things. And so episode 9 gets into a couple of examples of the way in which the church utilized that energy in kind of the political sphere and making a kind of political stance. So I think that I'm encouraging you to, if you haven't listened to it, to kind of there's definitely an arc that is going on, but also there's something of parallel that happens in the episodes that you'll see, and kind of episode 2 parallels a little bit episode 9. Anyway, so we can talk about that at some point after when if folks want to stay around, a longer conversation. But yeah, I think that you can get a taste of that in the series.
That's great. No, and what you're saying all also kind of coalesces, right, with the point that folks like Heather White and those of us who are kind of writing this area have been really trying to tease out with our work, which is that there's this way in which gay religious organizations and institutions, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, really formed these institutional anchors for the movement in a way that hasn't been appreciated in the history, right? And everything from providing meeting space to funding to leadership to overlap in membership. And so it's just exciting to see that coming out in this project, but also the way there are through lines between this project and kind of other work that's happening in this area, including through the work that's being done through the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network. As we wind down, we do have a question from the audience, and I will go ahead and ask that. And the question is this: concerning the funerals and memorials, can you talk about any noteworthy or interesting mourning or even celebratory patterns, rites, rituals, practices, etc., that emerged from the archives, either the audio or the paper archives or the interviews? I'm particularly curious about the role of race and ethnic culture. Similarly, beyond sorrow from the sermons and eulogies especially, what can you say about how the congregation articulated its theology of death and dying?
Well, that's a big question. So it's a little hard to generalize because, of hundreds and hundreds of members who died, and then hundreds more of worship, of funerals and memorial services that MCC San Francisco hosted, we have maybe a dozen recordings, I think maybe not even that many, of actual worship services. So I would hesitate to give a very comprehensive answer. But some of the things that stand out to me that MCC San Francisco did, I mean, first, the bottom line of just being a church that welcomed all of the people who were mourning the deceased, all of the people, their lovers, their ex-lovers, their parents, their tricks, their, neighbors, the person who delivered their mail, whoever it was, whoever wanted to be there, all of those folks were welcome. MCC San Francisco often served as a alternative memorial site. Like some people would have, their parents would have, very solemn memorial services in the Presbyterian Church where nothing was mentioned and a lover was tucked away in the back if they were lucky. And MCC really valued being a space where the truth of the life of the deceased could be spoken and spoken as fully as possible. And one way they manifested that was in something that's less unusual now, but I think at the time was quite unusual, was they would have multiple people speak at a memorial service. This makes a sort of pragmatic sense because no one clergy person could preach that many eulogies, especially about people they didn't know. But also, this was a church that recognized a lot of different people had a lot of different kinds of perspectives on any given person, and those were all valuable perspectives to share. So you could hear a coworker, you could hear a biological relative. A story that Ariana loves to tell is the funeral of a guy named Art Plaskett, a friend of his who became friends with him in the last year of his life, loaned him her cat because she thought he was lonely and needed to have a feline companion. So this woman gave him her cat until he was actually too sick to care of the cat and then took the cat back. And this is a story she told on this tape at his memorial service. So that's one thing that immediately comes to mind. Siri, do you want to add to that?
Well, I was thinking the same thing, that the importance of kin and how the expansive notion of what kin was. But the other thing I was thinking in relation to the portion of the question about kind of ethnic and racial integration in terms of kind of cultural practices. Again, we don't have enough of the memorial services to be able to make a kind of definitive, like, oh yes, what you can see. But we do have some evidence of the way in which people's backgrounds were integrated, and one that we talk about in episode 7, sorry, in episode 7, used to be 8. Is Scott Galateria, and is one of the characters, and he is Hawaiian, and a major part of the memorial service for his lover and then for him was integrating kind of hula and Hawaiian culture into the service. And it's a memory that everyone has, and so they talk about it. And so I think that there are, I wonder, would another church have done that as much? Maybe, but for sure the space was there at MCC SF. And there were never any questions asked, like, this is who we are. Bring all of you, and that does mean your cultural background, your ethnic and racial background, and as well as your kin.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess since we are at our time, and so I would just ask one last question to both of you, which I think ties into this, and that is really about the contemporary relevance of the story. Given the current the cultural and political climate, what do you think this story, this MCC San Francisco's experience of the AIDS crisis, continues to say to us today? And what do you want the audience to take away after they're done listening to this podcast?
One of the most important ones for me is how to sit in a crisis that is existential, political, bodily, terrifying, grief-filled, that you don't know when it's going to end, and just keep sitting through it because I feel like for all of the 14 years that we've been working on this and that I've been working on this, I felt like we've been in a place like that. And only more so as the years have gone on and we've been facing a situation that we know is an existential threat to so many people and to so many institutions and to so many values. And we do not know when or how it will end and what it means to come together in faith, whether that faith has a particular theological or religious tradition or whatever it is, to come and sit in expectation to imagine possibility as a way of addressing the crises ahead. I think MCC San Francisco teaches us an important lesson in gathering, in sitting, in cultivating hope without knowing, in facing things that are truly terrible, but facing them together and making them different.
And we talk a lot about in the show, and we talk a lot about it. We talked a lot about it as we put these episodes together about how the theme of just showing up, and that the important thing is not that you perform anything. It's literally just being there. It's just showing up, because sometimes that's all you can do. But the act of presence is such a powerful thing, and just being with people is really is beautiful, and that's one of the lessons that I think people can take from that, particularly through, I mean, we started when COVID hit, and we were still working on this project. We were like, oh my goodness, this is like, there was so many resonances to it. But what I'm also surprised with is how quickly we have forgotten the COVID in a way. Like, we're just kind of like, well, let's just move through it, keep going. And I think that perhaps we need to sit a little bit longer, and just and remember, and think, and so the art of remembering, the art of being present with others, and then, as Lynne said, and as we've talked about, the fundamental importance of community are the things that I think matter.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And that seems like a perfect place to leave it tonight. Lynne and Siri, thank you so much for being here tonight and for sharing this wonderful story with us. It's been great to be in a conversation with you tonight.
I think for myself, as the current pastor of MCC San Francisco, first of all, I want to thank Lynne and Siri and Danny for a lively conversation and discussion, and also for the Lynne and Siri and all of Eureka Street Productions for the creation of this goldmine of emotions and memories and connecting us to our ancestors. As I listen to this as sermon fodder for each Sunday, the last 10 weeks, I've been listening to it, and it weaves into my sermons over the last 10 weeks, and whether directly or indirectly, and it reminds me of the ancestors that came before us, the shoulders that we are standing on top of at MCC San Francisco. My history with this church is, compared to the 55 years we've been around, I've been connected with this church for probably 12 years, 10 years. 10 years ago is when they ordained me, and I've been as leadership for the last 20 months or so. And it has been phenomenal. And I continually every week say, have you listened to it? Raise your hand if you've been listening to it. And there is so much richness there. And there are handfuls of people that are still at the church that their voices are on those tapes, as well as they're still sitting in the pews at the church. And I get to listen to Mother Lynne Jordan tell the stories, recount the stories, and tell me, that she knows where all the bones are, and the bodies are buried, and that's in episode 10. I don't want to spoiler alert, but but it is so rich. And if you haven't listened to all of them, I highly recommend it. I will listen to them again. And it is so important to hear this history of this community and of the challenges that they faced and how they surmounted those challenges and dealt with the crisis. And the person who dealt with the crises firsthand, who is throughout most of these tapes, is the Reverend Dr. Jim Mitulski, who is here to share with you about his experience.
Thanks, Daniel. And thank you to Lynne and Siri and Ariana, and also thank you to Danny and to LGBT RAN for hosting this webinar today. I want to speak in this moment as representing the Metropolitan Community Church denomination and express our collective gratitude for this webinar and also for the scholarship that Lynne, Siri, and Ariana did. You know, it was over 50 years ago that Troy Perry and Frida Smith and Nancy Wilson and others worked to create a self-determined church for gay and lesbian people. It's distinctive then, distinctive still. And it's only recently that scholars have been starting to tell the story, our story, with a real ear towards who we are, who we were, and who we are. I want to mention just a few: William Stell, Heather White, Lynne and Ari and Ariana and Siri, Danny. You know, people like you are really starting to take an interest in our story. And what we appreciate about this podcast is you let us tell our story too. You use our words. It's not people writing about us as if we were some peculiar sociological phenomena. We are real people, and we are queer religious people, and we're just grateful that this story is being told. So thank you, thank you, thank you. From the people in Metropolitan Community Churches, we want to tell our story. We're a particular slice of what was happening in queer religious life, but we're an important one. So we hope that you can be acquainted with us. And to the MCC people who are listening, this is our story. This is our song. So please listen to this. And let me just say one more time, thank you so much for letting these stories live.
Friends, within a few days, you will all receive an email with a link to the recording of tonight's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. If you're interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQREN website and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs as well as recordings of past presentations. Our next webinar on January 21st will feature Australian historian Timothy Jones interviewing Lucas Wilson on his recently published anthology, Shame, Sex, Attraction: Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. Sign up on the website to get the Zoom link to join this illuminating online program. Once again, I offer deep gratitude to Danny, Lynne, and Siri for their illuminating presentation. Good night to all.